Okay, guys, I'm just going to play a really short video. There's a wonderful organization in Montreal called the Montreal Black History Roundtable. And it just blew my mind. This year was one of the laureates. They picked 12 Black Montrealers every year to honor us for our work in the community. And it's such an honor to be a part of these amazing laureates. But here, what they did is they make up the calendar, and each of us is a different month, and I'm February, what? Anyway, and we each pick a hero that we give honor to for inspiring us, and mine was Bob Marley, what? and then we did a short video each talking about our experiences and what it is that motivates us and what we do. So I'm just going to play that for you quickly, and then I'll just finish the last part with a little talk, okay?
As a scholar of visual art and culture, I'm in a field that tends to misrepresent people of color and Black people and underrepresent us. At the moment, I'm the first and the only Black art historian in the nation, and art history is a field that's taught across the nation. So we really need to think about why this discipline that's ubiquitous is so unattractive to Blacks. So for me, a part of the issue of why Black History Month is so relevant and important is that Black people have actually been in Canada that we know of since 1605. The first Black person to set foot in Canada was Matthew da Costa, and he was actually a translator between the Portuguese and the Mi'kmaq on a Portuguese vessel. So Matthew, that we know of, was not a slave. But after that, subsequent to that, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, how we arrived in this nation was as someone else's property, as chattel. And now, as people of the African diaspora, we're quite commonly exposed to some sense of a history of slavery in our own homes, even though it's not taught to us in schools in Canada. But what happens is we're taught to focus on the more dramatic and spectacular forms of violence to which we were subjected, like branding, like beating, like shackling, like breeding. But something that slavery does and did to us is that it actually denied us the right to represent ourselves. Euro-Canadians and Euro-Americans across the Americas actually hoarded their access to cultural production, which meant that as Black people, we were denied the right to represent ourselves. Any people that doesn't represent themselves is a people that becomes marginalized and brutalized. So we were socialized generation after generation into deprivation, but not just physical and material deprivation, but cultural deprivation. So what Black History Month gives us the opportunity to do is to see ourselves through the eyes of ourselves and our community. This is huge for us as Black people because, again, it's something that we've been denied for 400 years.
Okay, so guys, what I meant to say, obviously, I know I'm not the only Black art historian. I meant to point out that I was the only one teaching in a Canadian university at the moment. I was the first one when I started at Western in 2001. And that, obviously art history is being taught everywhere in the country in terms of universities and colleges. So I wanted to consider why it is that we're not represented, which some of you wonderful people have already pointed out. So I'm just going to read something really briefly here to just point out some of the foci of my research foci. So my research has been particularly engaged with the issue of how Black subjects have been represented in historical Western art, mainly by white artists. The critical questions for me are, number one, who has access to cultural production at a given historical moment? Number two, who has access to self-representation? Number three, what does it mean to possess or to be denied cultural capital? Number four, what types of artistic, cultural, and material traces do marginalized populations like the enslaved leave behind? And I'm talking about people who are marginalized economically, socially, legally. And number five, how have colonialism and imperialism transformed cultural production and artistic representation? And here I'm guided by, Edward Said's brilliant Cultural Imperialism, and also a lot by scholars like Gilroy and Antonio Benitez Rojo as well. So in particular, my research reveals my fascination and deep critical interest in the cultural workings of transatlantic slavery and the often horrific and mind-boggling practices like torture, breeding, and labor. I'm particularly interested in the transgressive potential of the enslaved, both as producers of unique art and culture, and as critical and often forgotten viewers of high art. And this is key. We often forget that, like, who's cleaning the painting? Who's actually dusting the frame of the painting? So it's hard for us, though, to recuperate the opinions of the enslaved about the high art, which they would have been, caretakers of in places like big houses, great houses on plantations, or in places like Canada as well. So in the former area, I'm fascinated by the idea of the enslaved producing mainly popular culture at the behest or being coerced to produce pop culture, things like soap, candles, furniture, clothing, for their white masters and mistresses, as well as their own clandestine cultural productions like drumming, music culture, dance, rituals, grooming, dress, etc. And their methods of maintaining and protecting these practices through resistance from white interference and regulation. So in particular, I seek to question not only the creation and working of white cultural privilege within slavery, but the ways that strategic and enforced social and cultural deprivations attempted, and not always successfully, to limit and prohibit the cultural lives of the enslaved. So if you think about, for instance, across the Americas, drumming was banned, right? Because they understood that you could talk on the drum and communicate across plantations, for instance, right? So how did we overcome those enforced limitations? So conducting research on slavery poses several major challenges. Since transatlantic slavery transpired over 400 years, of course from the 1400s to 1800s, one of the things are where are the materials, and also what traces could the enslaved leave. And then of course, even when an enslaved person left a cultural trace, an art object, head wrap, etc., who collected it? Who bothered to preserve it? So then the challenge as a scholar is that you're working constantly with white sources, what white people thought historically about the enslaved. So you're always working against the grain to critically kind of reread that stuff. Okay, so the last thing I want to just mention is that the book I'm working on now is trying to move away from images like this, actually, because I've been focusing for a long time on the black body. And that's, I think, a problem that in race and representation and in critical practice of transatlantic slavery and the visual practice of transatlantic slavery, we often think, slavery, give me a black subject. And we forget that, what about reading an image of a white planter or a white ship's captain, right? Or the merchant or the landscape. So what I'm doing now, my project is looking at juxtaposing Jamaica and Montreal as two sites of the British Empire, and reconnecting, excavating, doing archaeology that connects the landscape art in terms of both of them being British holdings of transatlantic slavery within the 19th century. And if you think about it, they're both garrisons as well, right? They based British regulars there for periods. In Montreal, they had soldiers based there for 110 years. And you needed soldiers to protect the valuable colony, of course, because of the traffic and things like sugar that were going back and forth. So the one thing just I want to close to point out is that in Canada, we often think of the enslaved populations as being first African American and then coming to Canada and becoming African Canadian. But we've forgotten that in the traffic and the transits of those merchant ships, they would be full of rum, sugar, molasses, but they'd have 5, 10, 15, 20 slaves on board too, right? So there was a constant traffic in slaves who had already been creolized as Caribbean and had been Caribbeanized, who'd be transplanted twice sometimes in a lifetime and deposited in places like Montreal and Halifax. So that's what my new project is to compare and to juxtapose a temperate climate space with the tropical space of Jamaica.